Hi everyone. Welcome to our show, The View from the Corners Office. In today's episode, we have R Gopalakrishnan sir. Gopal sir has an experience of more than 50 years in the professional service, with major stints at Unilever and Tata Sons. At Unilever, he served as the chairman of Unilever Arabia. He was the MD of Brooke Bond Lipton and the vice chair of Hindustan Lever. Post his stint with Unilever, he joined Tata Sons as the executive director. Currently, he serves as an independent director of Castrol India, independent director and vice chair of the chair of the board of Castrol India. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. Pleasure.
So, sir, we would love to start by knowing about your childhood and how was it growing up.
Well, it's a long time ago, 76 years ago to be precise. But I grew up in Calcutta. I was born in Calcutta. I grew up in Calcutta. And we were a nice family. My father was also a professional. My father came up the tough way. And I learned a lot of lessons out of the way he came up and brought us up. So, two lessons that stand out for me from my childhood. One is that live within your means. What happened was when I was about 12 or 13, my father, who was having a top job in a multinational insurance company, had some differences with the management. I'm not sure what they were. I was too young. But he quit his job and we were 6 kids at home. And, 1950s, to quit your job. And he was not a Cambridge graduate or an Oxford graduate. He was an ordinary guy from Tamil Nadu. Next 4 or 5 years, we lived off whatever he had saved. And instead of being driven around in a car, a Vauxhall car, I still remember, we were all now asked to take buses and trams to go to school. And the cutbacks were in everything other than in education. You saw less movies. You probably didn't eat chocolates as much as you did. But studies and education was never compromised. So live within your means and prioritize is one lesson that I learned from that. By the way, my father also took a bus or a tram. It's not just that he made the kids do it. The second thing that I remember very vividly is life is going to throw problems at you. Embrace them. Don't run away from them. So after 4 years or so, my father got a job, but it was in Bombay. And he had never lived in Bombay. None of us was in school in Bombay. We were all in school in Calcutta. And so it was quite an upheaval, given the conditions in those days. But he left along with my brothers, and my sisters had got married by then. And he left me at the age of 16 or whatever I was at that time, with the task of winding up the large house. We had a big bungalow, selling all the furniture and closing some court case that was going on, which I never understood. And I was, all my other friends were, schoolmates were, college mates were, going around Park Street in Calcutta to Trinkers and Fluries. And here I was running around auction houses. But while I did feel that it was too tough for me at that stage, I learned a lesson that the problem is thrown at you not because of your choice. The problem comes at you and you have to embrace it. And I'm very pleased that I actually did whatever I had to do, completed the tasks, and moved into the hostel. So those are the two lessons, overarching lessons, that I can remember from a very, very middle class upbringing in Calcutta.
And you said those two values which you learned. Were there those values quite beneficial, or can you attribute to that during your corporate years, or there were other values which you learned in your childhood which were very helpful when you were working in large corporations like Unilever and Tata Sons?
Well, there are many values everybody learns in younger days, and I'm not giving you a long list of them. Some of them will sound predictable. But I think these two were particularly stand out in my memory because they're a bit unusual. I grew up studying in a convent school, Jesuit school, and there were rich people and middle class people of all kinds in the school. But later during my career, sometimes I felt I had the tougher job than the other guy. And I was put a sales manager in one place when the other fellow had an easier job. Oh, it was my perception. It is not that it was true. And I said, embrace what you have. When I became the managing director of Brooke, my rival or competitor or a colleague who was also in line for the next big job in the company had what I thought was an easier job. That may or may not have been a correct perception. But I said, stop moping about it. Life throws its challenges at you and you play the ball as it comes down the wicket. And so I think they were practical sort of problems.
That's very true in terms of what you said. The perception that you might have when you were in that battle or when you were in that tenure. And we have covered a lot. I think I was checking that you have worked more than 30 years at Unilever. So what
Yes.
does that brand mean to you?
Well, I was very lucky. By the way, I'm a great believer in luck. You can call it providence, you can call it luck, you can call it God, you can call it spirituality, whatever you want to call it. Luck is something which you have not earned, but something nice happens to you. And sometimes something bad also happens to you. It's unearned luck, good or bad. I joined Unilever, which is a very, very fine company, grounded in its values, quite Anglo-Saxon in their ways and processes, quite different from Tata in that sense. Tata is a very Indian company, again, highly professional, highly ethical, and quite grounded. So I will always remember Unilever as a company which is long living and sustainable company. It has been around for 100, 150 years. So has Tata, by the way. So one of my favorite subjects is what makes a company sustainable and long living. Just like people study old age in human beings and come to conclusions that people in this island, eat fish and they drink whiskey and are they long living because of that. I've worked in two very fine, ethical, long living companies. So I have a lot of interest in the subject of sustainable and long living companies. I've even done a research project with SP Jain Institute of Management about how it is not enough to have good CEOs of good companies, but you must have builders of great institutions. And of course, the research was not about Unilever and Tata, but I drew a lot from my experience. Unilever is a lovely company, and so is Tata.
So you were talking about Tata Sons, or Tata being like the nation builder for India, and Tatas have contributed a lot over these years, in even Unilever. So any leadership experience or lessons that you learned in Tata Sons over your tenure of the last, or over your tenure of 17 years?
Well, there are a lot of lessons you learn. One of the lessons I learned in Tata is that it is important to be ethical, but don't think of ethics as a thin line dividing right and wrong, which is a very Anglo-Saxon European way of thinking. Uh, Ethics is also dependent on a circumstance. And the punishment you give, depending on whether you judge it to be unethical, can be dependent on the extent of the crime, the error, not crime. That's the wrong word to use. So I have a very favorite example when I was in Unilever, which is very Anglo-Saxon, process orientated. somebody fudged an expense statement, and he had served the company 35 years. But having established that he fudged it for a very, very small amount, after 30 years of service, the guy was sacked. Now, getting sacked anywhere is a tough thing. And certainly in India, back in the 50s or 60s, it was almost suicidal. But Unilever said, it's either right or wrong. There's a very thin line separating it. That's how I grew up thinking about ethics. When I came to Tata, although nobody told me what I'm about to repeat as a metaphor, they said there's a very thin line at one end which is ethical, and very thin line which is unethical. In between, there's a vast mass which is depends. Just like in Hindu philosophy, we say it all depends on the circumstance. So there was a girl, 40 years of age, and she's a secretary, and she had fudged her expense statement of something. And we found that she had indeed fudged it. But the view that Tata's took was, she had a very tough time. She's supporting her mother for cancer. She's herself single, and she needs all the money. And we stopped her increment for 2 years, but we didn't sack her. There was a fierce debate among some of my colleagues whether you should sack her and make it a very representative punishment. But we said that you must have a punishment which is appropriate to the error and the context. So they were both right. I can't say one of them is wrong, but Unilever was a rather different perception of what is right and wrong as compared to Tata's.
Wow, I was just thinking about how different ways of or school of thoughts work in these two institutes and in different institutes. And I think you were touching about your research, which you did with SPJIMR, SPJN for leadership and trying to understand the traits. So there was one question where we want to understand what are the common traits you would have seen among leaders that reach the top and most importantly are able to sustain at that level.
Yeah, our interest in the research was not so much about who reaches the top, because that's much written about, and not sure that there's much to research there. But people who get to the top end up having an empathy deficit in their human relations. And I just want to make the point that one of the things we found, because we were researching people who are building institutions, not good CEOs. And we found that there are 8 arrows in their bow, to use the metaphor, 8 arrows in their bow. 3 of them are compulsory to use, 5 of them are optional. Very much like a golfer has 10 clubs and he can't use all the clubs all the time, but he uses certain clubs more frequently. He uses a driver, he uses a putter, and maybe a mid-iron, and the rest of them he uses depending on the circumstance. And it's exactly the same metaphor. And the 3 most important essential attributes were what I call a management mindset, behavior, and action with regard to people power. And this is very unique because you won't find this very commonly in international research on companies of good to great, excellent companies. They will have a mention of people power, but that it is the most important attribute would not come out in many of the international books. The second one we found is the ability to balance short-term and long-term. Many young people, especially in Gen Z, as you call it, often wonder how to manage the short-term and the long-term. And the most common thing I've heard from people is, oh, well, it's so difficult to manage day-to-day work that there's no time to have long-term thinking. And we found that institution builders are able to use their immediate memory for short-term thinking and their long-term memory simultaneously, like a computer does, for long-term planning. And since giving a digital analogy may not appeal, I gave the example of go home and watch your mother or your sister or your wife, how she raises a kid. And she does it intuitively, not because she did an MBA from Cranfield or somewhere. Uh, the baby is crying and yelling, it's got colic. She will ring up Padmini, Yamini, whoever her friend is, and find out how to deal with that. But at the same time, she never ceases to dream whether her daughter will become a professor or a consultant or a doctor. So women are very good examples of balancing short-term and long-term. And the women will say that I don't get time to think about my child's long-term future, but by God, she does find the time. So that is the second MBA. And the last one is what I call critical thinking. And critical thinking is the ability to be a geologist and an astronomer at the same time. You know, the skills of a geologist, most of us study engineering, accountancy, MBA. We are trained as geologists. The moment you look at an object, you say, what is inside it? And we dig into the ground and find zinc and water and whatever. An astronomer looks up at the sky, opposite direction, and says, what is this a part of? So if you land a geologist and an astronomer on planet Moon, on the moon, one will start digging and giving you reports about what he found inside. The other will look up to the sky and say, oh my God, I see all these other things. And this is what I call critical thinking. Most managers are trained to go into the subject, to analyze critically what is there inside the subject. But they never fail, they often fail to see what is the subject a part of, what is the context. And that I call an astronomer's skill. And these are the three most important. I won't go into the other five in the interest of time, because it's all there in the books that we have written. But these three were very, very distinctive, very distinctive. And I don't find that it has been expressed in this manner in the research done in Jim Collins or Waterman and Price and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much for these frameworks or these lessons that we are getting today. And on a separate note, this is I want to understand in your professional experience, you would have seen a lot of failures. So how did you deal with it? And a follow up on though that would be, what are the key lessons that you learned from that?
Well, I know it is said by everybody, so I'm saying a cliche. You learn more from failure than from success. Having said that, without failure, you can't have success. So I failed once when I became I had many failures, I suppose, but the ones that I remember for this purpose today, when I had become a young, freshly minted director of Hindustan Lever, I was only 41. If you're a director of Hindustan Lever at 41, in those days, 35 years ago, you're a big cat, or so you thought. But I found a fraud had happened in my department. And I was shocked, in spite of our having all the best systems, because it had happened in a field of business which is not the traditional business, the knitting of the company, It had happened in a business of garments. And we were not in garment people. And the ethics and the standards in the garment industry are different from soap industry. I'm not saying they're all crooks, but the flexibilities there are greater than in a professionally run consumer goods company. The question was, having found what looked like a failure, how will I deal with it? And I found, when I think back, I had three options. One was to deny that there was any failure, and to wait to get more facts. The second one was to accept that there's been some failure and I don't know exactly what it has failed, and to seek help from the rest of the company, from the chairman and the board. And the third one was to sit on the fence, which is neither accepting nor denying, but keep waiting for more details to come out. And what I learned from that was, when you're in trouble, seek help. It's better to look like a fool with your chairman, who's one person, than to look like a fool in the newspaper. So I went to my chairman and admitted I probably showed my vulnerability of being on top of a particular situation where a fraud had happened. And I must say, I'm very happy I did it intuitively, but I did the right thing. Because the whole company, the finance department, the legal department, everybody got in to help. They must have gossiped among themselves that this guy is an idiot. He's just become a director and he's goofed. But it was saved. The problem was finally solved. And I must say, to the credit of Unilever, it didn't stand in my way of my career development. I was then posted as chairman of Unilever Arabia. I suppose the leadership lesson there is if a guy can admit an error, he's got more success in him. If he can't admit the error and he has fudged it, then he's probably a dangerous leader. I don't know. I'm assuming that.
Understood. So I think
in today's corporate world where there are so many scams, Nick Leeson, there are people who do trades one too many. There are people who think they can get away with it and didn't get away with it. There are people who didn't intend to defraud the bank, but they've ended up not being able to pay back the bank. If people would follow this approach of saying it's better to admit your mistake and to try to correct it, I think we would be far better as a system of ethics in the corporate world.
I think you're absolutely right. And especially for the younger generation, the millennials and Gen Z, and this is the last question that I would want to touch upon. You have already said a lot of your experiences, but what advice would you give to these Gen Z and millennials that wish to follow the path that you have undertaken or a similar path that you would have undertaken?
Well, I don't know if my path is worth undertaking, but let's say that you want to lead a fulfilling and professional career, right? And be a happy man when you're 60 or 70 or whatever. I just have one piece of, I hesitate to call it advice because millennials don't like to be lectured. I would say that the rules of the game for your career are very simple, like golf. I don't know if you play golf, but any sport that you play, the rules are very simple. It is practicing it consistently that's the problem. So it's very easy to be ethical most of the time. But that 3% of the time when you really should have been ethical and you failed is what determines what's a crook. I mean, all the people we arraign as crooks today are not born crooks. They have run empires. They're hiding in London or somewhere or the other. They're not congenital crooks. It's that ability, like a golfer would, to have the same swing time and again. So it is thought, reflection, practice that makes for perfection. And I find, maybe I'm getting old, young people prone to the thought that you're born a genius. I'm an entrepreneur. I built up a $4 billion company, so I'm cat. And they think that it's like a guy who's hit a half century on his first test innings, in cricket. And then they think that they are fantastic and proven batsmen. There is nothing called a proven business leader. You're proving yourself every day. And if young people can remember this, we'll have entrepreneurs who are more humble. We got examples of entrepreneurs who are arrogant and who think they're all like Steve Jobs. I would say to them, it is better to know that it is the painstaking. If I see a golfer playing superb scratch golf for 2 below his handicap, I'll say, wow, but I don't know how many hours he has spent practicing that. And you have to understand that people have practiced, failed, made mistakes, practiced again. And that's the only way to do it. The number of rules are pretty simple. And I will not give you the work hard, be ethical. That's no point telling you all that.
I think that just reminds me of a quote which I heard from Usain Bolt. He says, I practiced for 4 years just for 10 seconds.
Exactly. It is that 10 seconds that makes a difference.
Yes. And on that note, I just want to thank you, sir, for coming for this session. And this brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for doing this. And
thank you. And I wish you well. I'm very happy that you're undertaking to do what you're doing, because I think a lot of people in my age group who are approaching the end of their careers and maybe even their lives, have acquired two types of wealth. One is a little bit of savings, and that they leave for the family, and the other one is experience, and they don't get a chance to share it. So you're going to help a lot of people to die empty. That's very good. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.